Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, not the Thursday, because obviously tomorrow is Anzac Day for those based in Australia and New Zealand. So day off for everyone, and I hope you absolutely enjoy it. So thank you for joining us on this Wednesday. Today we have an absolutely amazing speaker, and we will dive into him. But as always, we first have to go to a couple other protocols. First of all, being obviously acknowledgement of country. Before we begin today, we would like to recognize the traditional owners of the different lands on which we meet. For those based on Sydney, that is the Gadigal land, and acknowledge the Indigenous people that may be joining us today. We would like to pay our respect to all elders, past and present, and wish to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of Indigenous people and cultures across Australia, or from wherever you may be joining today. Now, we'd also really like to shout out our sponsor, which is the UTS Economics team. They have a newly developed postgrad program in behavioral economics for those who are interested. They offer free online introduction to behavioral economics, online micro-credentials, and a graduate certificate and master's in behavioral economics. So you can definitely find something to your liking. Designed to train the next generation of behavioral economists. To learn more, head to the link in the chat. Now, I also have the absolute pleasure, and you probably have already seen him on screen, of introducing Dr. Alex Gyani, who is now the recently appointed Managing Director of the Behavioural Insights team in the Australian office across the APAC region. He's been based in Sydney since 2014, and he's worked across a plethora of policy areas. And I'm not even going to list them because I have a strong suspicion that Alex will talk to several of them as he takes you through the next decade of behavioral science for Australia, and I'm assuming, just in general, maybe also the APAC region in a slightly larger definition. So I think it is probably best if I just stay quiet and I let Alex take over, because he has 56 minutes left to talk you through a decade worth of behavioral development. So I'm very keen to hear it. Please take it away, Alex.
Cool. Thank you very much, Bella. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I mean, actually, in starting to pull together this presentation, I actually wanted to talk about the last sort of 10 years of where we come from. So we'll see where we get to over the next 50 odd minutes. But before I do that, I also want to acknowledge the fact that I'm dialing in from Gadigal land here, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal First Nations people who might be on the call. Yeah, it's a beautiful land that we have here, and I think it's important that we recognise it and our traditional owners across Australia. In terms of things that I wanted to cover, as I mentioned before, I think it's always worthwhile to look to our past before looking at our future. So I just want to give a quick overview of the history of some of the controversies and successes when it comes to behavioural science in the UK and Australia. So you can guess I'm originally from the UK, and as is our team. And then focus on a couple of challenges that we're talking about quite a lot in the field. So the challenges of replicability, the challenges of scalability, and dealing with complex systems. These are actually things that I think have featured in the history of behavioral science for quite a period of time, but now I think they're really coming to a head, which is great because it means that we can really start to address these challenges and think deeply about, what do they mean for us? What do they mean for our work? How do we improve our work by actually facing these challenges directly? Before I jump into that, I do want to give a shout out and sort of a congratulations to the Behavioural Economics Network and the meetup that we have here. It's been 10 years since it kicked off, since Will and Jason started it. In a small event that was at the Art House Theatre here in Sydney. You can see there's the poster for it. The key thing to call out was the not a private function bit. So when we were talking about sort of behavioral economics and how it can change the world, we were in the little corner of the restaurant there with many bemused diners. But I think it just speaks to the spirit of this community, which is, we get our hands dirty, we think about implementation, we think about not just the big ideas, but how do we get them done in the real world. So yeah, I really just want to acknowledge the hard work of Mola, Alison, Grace, Aaron, Jason, and Will continuing this meetup, and also to everyone on the line who's joining us. If there are any people who first heard about this because they were bemused diners in October 2014, fantastic. I think the key thing is how do we talk about these ideas and get them out there, and this is exactly what this group is doing, so it's wonderful. So where did it all start? So the team that I work here at is the Behavioural Insights team. Our team started off in 2010 as part of a coalition between the centre-right Conservative Party and the centre-left Liberal Democrat Party. So it really was a bipartisan effort thinking about how we can use behavioural science to make policy better. And the mandate that we were given was this in the coalition statement, saying our government will find intelligent ways to encourage support and enable people to make better choices for themselves. So I had these ideas of libertarian paternalism, which you'll hear people like Rich Taylor and Cass Sunstein talk about. But the crux of it was really, how do we build systems that help people make better choices using things like behavioral science? So behavioral economics, social psychology, anthropology, and put them into applied settings. Now, right from the get-go, this wasn't an uncontroversial idea. And in fact, I just pull out this piece here by Ben Goldacre, who's a very, very respected science journalist writing at The Guardian at the time. He's a medical doctor who had this to say, which I'll let you read it rather than me reading it out. But I think it is actually a really key thing that we need to reflect on as practitioners, because it's very easy to make statements based on some research, but we really need to make sure that those ideas, when we implement them and affect the lives of citizens or customers, is actually robust. So whilst Ben was writing this, he wasn't actually aware of the fact that we were not just taking ideas from behavioral science, but we were trying to trial them and test them as rigorously as possible. So a very early experiment that we did looked at the effect of social norms letters. So social norm being something like 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, to see whether or not that would get people to pay their tax if they hadn't yet done so. And it's important to notice here that Her Majesty's Revenue Customs at the time weren't convinced that this would work. There were some people in HMRC who thought, actually, this is a good idea and it's worth testing. So we ran a trial and we evaluated it empirically to see what the impact was. And lo and behold, what we did was we found that if you compared the message that didn't have that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time to the control group, then there was an uplift in terms of the people who paid their time just by including that extra line. And not only did we just test that letter, we test versions of it. So, if you said 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their tax on time, it increased a little bit. If you then become more specific, then it goes up and up and up. And not only were we then taking ideas from the behavioral economics and the behavioral science literature, we're also then giving them back and saying, do they work at scale? Which I think is something that we've always kind of had, is that empirical bent. And Ben, to his credit, acknowledged the fact that we were doing this and actually became a keen supporter of the team. He wrote a piece with us called Test, Learn, Adapt, to really spruik the ideas of we should find out what works and trial these ideas, not just when it comes to behavioral economics, but more broadly public policy. So you can see here, behavioral science, there were some controversies, but we dealt with them by actually leaning into becoming more empirical. Not only that, what we've seen over the last decade is just a huge expansion of BI teams. As I mentioned, we were set up in 2010, then came over to set up a team in New South Wales in 2013. My predecessor Roy did that, and I joined him in 2014. Along the way, we were also spreading and creating guides to help policymakers or the wider community think about how they can distill the insights from behavioral science and address it to public policy. We then had teams being set up in the Obama administration, Beta in Canberra, and also just across the world. And I think this is just a testament to the fact that, once you've got compelling ideas with robust data, people will take notice. Not everybody, but it does demonstrate and does actually get these ideas out and proliferate. Yeah, you can see that has happened now globally. So it's worth just unpicking a few early successes in Australia. When we first started off, we were trying to look at similar ideas to the ones that we tested in the UK, so getting people to pay up either tax or fines. One of the first instances was some projects that we ran with the Department of Premier and Cabinet and the Office for State Revenue, and they said we wanted to look at enforcement orders. And our first question was, cool, what's an enforcement order? Because it isn't particularly sort of intuitive. And they said, right, it's an unpaid fine. It's like, all right, cool. Well, let's think about how we might get people to pay more attention, increasing the salience of that. let's actually just call it an unpaid fine. I said, oh, well, we can't do that really because an enforcement order is what it's called in the legislation. So we worked with them to start crafting out, what this new letter might look like. Said, right, they won't have to speak their lawyers. We still need to call it enforcement order, but actually we can change that to say, it's an unpaid fine and have that at the top. And I'm going to show you the revised letter, which may trigger some of our New South Wales people dialing in from New South Wales, but this is what we ended up coming up with. So now it says unpaid fine. If you squint carefully, you can see this is your notice under Section 59 of the Fines Act, and it is an enforcement order. So we're working collaboratively to kind of get these BI ideas out there, and then also increasing the salience by saying, pay now. And also there's some social norms there later. So this was also then trial and tested in the same way that I was describing before, and we could see, yes, there was an uplift in the number of people paying their fines. It is rolled out across New South Wales, has brought forward $10 million of fines being paid per annum. And a really important thing to call out here is that we didn't just look at the fine payment rate. We considered sort of what were the downstream effects across that system and what are the impacts. So you can see here that there were nearly 9,000 fewer driving licenses cancelled or suspended because of this initial point. Because if you don't pay your fine, then ultimately it increases, but you may be then taken to court and you may lose your license, which has huge economic implications for anybody. If you lose your driver's license in a rural or remote town, like your economic prospects, your employment prospects just plummet, and so do your social prospects. You can't, meet people in the community if you can't drive to see them quite often. So in this instance here, we're really careful just to think about the wider system implications and understand the fact that, quite often people aren't bad people. Obviously, some bad people aren't paying their fines, but there are some people who are just bad at bureaucracy or really busy, who have complicated and complex lives. So actually, we are doing the public a service by thinking about, how do we make these messages most salient and use behavioral science to do so. So first of all, we were thinking about how do we take ideas that we take trialed in the UK and replicate them in New South Wales and then Australia more broadly, but then also other more complex areas and complex issues that we can be applying these ideas to. And one of them that we started working on in 2015, 2016 were domestic violence, or family violence, domestic abuse is the preferred term now, for various reasons that we can go into offline, which is an issue that affects lots of people. One of the key things that we did was really try and understand the system, and we looked at the apprehended domestic violence orders that people in New South Wales were receiving, so perpetrators were receiving. And one of the key things that came out was that they weren't particularly well understood. So one of the key ideas of behavioral science is make things easy. And when we ran this through a readability assessment, we found that the readability levels for the order as it currently stood was 13.5 years of education. Now, domestic abuse is an issue that many people across the population face, but most people, full stop, do not have 13.5 years of education. So we're designing interventions and systems and solutions that just aren't fit for most of our population. So we worked really hard to simplify them. We also, through doing user testing, found that there were specific phrases that were just clearly being misunderstood. So the previous orders made reference to molestation, which in a legal setting meant general harassment, but was widely being interpreted as sexual molestation, which meant that people thought that they were following their orders when they actually weren't. So by simplifying it, you just made it really clear to both the victim survivor and the perpetrator defendants, what they had to do. That was rolled out across New South Wales. Other jurisdictions have adopted similar ideas, and we were also able to test it in Aotearoa, New Zealand, not in the case of domestic and family violence, but in broader bail notices. And we found that actually by simplifying the notices, we had a huge decrease in people not attending court. So more people attended court, which again led to fewer wider system effects in terms of their access to justice or how long things take to close cases. So you can see here how quite simple interventions do actually have these wider impacts and are very, very powerful. So not only has the behavioral science community, I guess, taken on more complex problems, but we've also been thinking about what are the other toolkits and methods that we can use and develop to create better solutions and interventions that do our work better. So the picture here on the left is of something we call the No Filter Forum. So we worked funded by the Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation to understand how do young people make ethical decisions online, and how do we, I guess, support young people through a changing online environment where they're being asked to make lots of decisions that, you know, very few people understand, let alone their parents, let alone, you know, their teachers. So we use some of the methods like big co-design workshops and deliberative forums to empower young people to say, look, here's the technocratic behavioral evidence, but also we need to understand your lived experience so we can understand those issues better through a behavioral lens, and then come together to start designing ideas and programs and interventions that might help. Similarly, the ideas that are really common in the design thinking or human-centered design toolkit, so things like hackathons, have been used to great effect by the New South Wales government. So big shout out to Eva Koromilis, who's been driving a movement, it feels like, against the use of sludge, which is sort of the anti-nudge. It's the idea that there are a lot of little things in systems that stop us from getting what we want. And actually, by taking a really clear-eyed approach to removing sludge from government processes, from sort of customer-facing processes that any companies might have, you can have much better outcomes. So there we used hackathon-style approaches to kind of bust sludge under the very sort of wonderful sponsorship of Victor Dominello. And then we've also used ideas, which is referred to by the British Design Council as service safaris, where we would really try and not just get the lived experiences from people affected, as we have done through these sort of deliberative forums or co-design workshops, but thinking about, are there ways in which we can try and understand systems ourselves and then take a behavioral lens to redesigning them or thinking about how we might improve them. So on the right there, you can see one of our team members actually signing up as a gig economy worker, as a food delivery worker. The reason for that is that we were working with the Centre for Work Health and Safety to understand what are the health and safety risks that gig economy workers face. And actually, it was really interesting by going through that process of signing up, and then actually doing a few shifts, just to understand how some of the risks that you might assume are there aren't probably some of the critical ones. So we really try and make sure that we, try and understand systems through multiple different lenses, and not just say, look, we'll take this idea from an academic paper and then put it in situ. You really want to do that creative design work to understand what's going on. If you're interested, we do publish some toolkits on how to do that work. So this is one, the Explore paper that is available to everybody, just to kind of test out and see how you can apply behavioral science by using these human-centered design or design thinking methods. So here, I guess here are some key successes that we've had as a field, and I guess as a team, to think about how we can apply behavioral science in increasingly complex ways to increasingly complex problems. Australia as a whole, when it comes to the behavioral practice or the use of behavioral science in public policy, seems to be punching way above its weight. So the OECD have this map on different BI teams across the globe. Based on their data, Australia has the highest per capita number of teams globally, and I think actually the highest number of teams globally as well. I think there's a few duplicates in there, but I do think that actually BI has been a big success story here, and there have been some great examples of actually practitioners in Australia driving practice globally by thinking about different ideas, which is fantastic. So those were the successes, and I think I've hinted at some of the controversies that have happened throughout that period. So now we just want to deep dive into a few of them. So the first one seems to be becoming more and more common, which is this idea that there is no evidence for nudging, more generally. And you may also be scratching your head, because I've just given you sort of a bunch of examples that have been rigorously evaluated and do show that some of the the solutions that we developed were effective, but we'll get into that in a second. And then the second one is really, I think, epitomized by this paper, which makes the case that a lot of behavioral science interventions and solutions are very narrow in their focus. So they really focus on individual behavior rather than thinking about sort of systems more broadly. And what that's meant is that we aren't, we are just having this very atomized approach. And actually, we could be thinking about communities and systems writ large instead. So I'll go through these in turn. So the first one on the fact that nudges have no effect really does come out of a bunch of meta-analyses, which is a very common technique in clinical medicine. And the idea is basically, rather than look at individual studies to see whether or not something has an impact, you pull them together and then say, what is the overall impact of this intervention solution or whatnot? Now, the key thing here is that you need to meaningfully pull together a bunch of things to see whether or not they have an impact. So these ideas come from medicine. So if you want to look at what is the impact of cognitive behavioral therapy on depression, people have a generally strong sense of what cognitive behavioral therapy is, or actually it's used really commonly in pharmaceuticals, so you can say, actually, this is the specific pharmaceutical that we're looking at. Now, one of the problems that we've seen in a lot of the meta-analyses that have been run on the use of nudging is that there are so many different degrees of freedom that people can use to define what nudging is. So unless you're really clear on that, it can become quite meaningless. In the same way that if you say, do pills work? You haven't really defined the types of pills, nor have you really defined what they're focused on. You would probably also come up with a null effect. So I think a lot of these arguments that nudging doesn't work full stop are overstated, because there's been some very loose definitions on what we mean by nudging. And actually, when you start unpicking what is being looked at, you can actually see that some of these things are really, really strong. Like the idea of social norms and using those to change behavior is just has a very strong evidence base. Similarly, there's a huge study done recently on loss aversion, sort of a very classical idea from behavioral economics, where I think they replicated it in 95% of the times that they tested it, and that was done, I think, across 14 different countries. So you can see, actually, when you start thinking conceptually and theoretically around what are the things that we're actually testing, you can see that there's really strong evidence for some of these ideas. But if you start thinking more broadly and abstractly, then they start falling apart. Another thing that we can do is look at specific programs of work. So there's some great work done in the US, which combined some of the trials that were run by the team in the US under the What Works initiative and some of the government teams in the US, and said, actually, if we have access to all of the trials they've run, what are the overall impacts on the nudges or the interventions that have been implemented? It's a huge study with over 150 trials, many different interventions applying to nearly 25 million participants. And what do they find? Well, they found that there was an average effect of about 8% increase in whatever outcomes that they were looking at. Things like, how do we get more people of color to apply to the police force? How do we get take up of various different government services? Which I think gives you a strong sense that actually these things are effective when you start looking at specific instances. But I do want to add a word of caution here, which is, just because there is evidence that behavioral science interventions do work, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that we do will work. We need to keep testing and we need to keep trialing to understand, actually, are these things replicating? It's not a one-shot decision of saying, do nudges work, yes or no? It's a constant program to understand and constantly evaluate, are the things that we are doing effective? And it's important that we do that more globally, not just when it comes to behavioral science interventions. This report here that I've got up is quite a sobering report. It's done by the National Audit Office in the UK, which looked at all of government spending and then identified, actually, how many of these pieces of work are being evaluated. And the sobering stat is that of over 400 billion pounds, so nearly $1 trillion Aussie dollars worth of expenditure, how much of that had robust evaluation sort of built into it? How many evaluation plans were there? So 8% is quite a daunting statistic. And I mean, even if you're not dialing in from a government unit here, you should be thinking about, how much are we investing in R&D to see whether or not the things that we do are effective, and how thoughtful are we in pulling together those evaluation plans? Are we just looking at sort of your standard A/B tests or click-throughs, or actually are we thinking about the ultimate behaviors that we want to impact? If you are so inclined to say, cool, that's great, that's the UK, not here, the stat for Australia seems to be roughly in line based on some work that CEDA did. So it's 5% rather than 8%. So yes, we can do a lot better here as well. And I think hopefully when we are faced with the challenge of, do our ideas replicate, are they appropriate for the settings in which we're operating in? We should say, we think so, because we've kind of used historical robust evidence, but we will keep testing and trialing. And that's the way that we kind of deal with that challenge. It also leads me on to another key thing that we need to think about, which is the idea of scaling ideas. So quite often we might test something in one setting and then want to scale it into another. Or we might run a trial and then see, actually, is there further take up of that idea further down the track? And Liz Linos, whose paper I showed earlier, looked at this. Not only to see what interventions were effective, but then how many of them were then taken up further down the track. And that also had some quite sobering statistics. So they looked at 70 odd interventions, and they found that of those, only 27% of them had actually been scaled. What was really interesting then was they looked at which factors were associated with successful scaling. So first of all, because there's solid RCT evidence behind this, the key thing to think about is, we would expect things that work are more likely to scale, right? That's what we hope for. That's what we really hope for. But they also looked at other factors, like, were the existing team present there? So do you have that body of knowledge? Do you have that motivation to see it through? Was the solution based on an existing process? How big was the population affected? Because obviously you really want to make sure that the ideas that affect a large number of people are the ones that are scaled, particularly if it's effective. And then other things like, what sector were they focused on? What comms channels are they using? These are largely sort of communications-based interventions. And I'll make you shout out, but just guess which one of these factors were sort of the key ones that led to scaling. If you want to put it in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Well, rather than torture too much, I'll give you the answers. If you guessed, did it work? That was not one of the factors that was associated with scaling. Actually, the things that really mattered were, was the existing team there to drive it through? So once you've done the trial, do you have the right people in place to then take it forward? Which makes sense because they're personally invested in developing it and hopefully then scaling it. And importantly, was the updated solution based on an existing process? Why is that important? Because it means that if you've got a system that actually is absorbative and can take up new ideas and doesn't require huge transformation projects, then actually your ideas are much more likely to be taken up. What does this mean for us? Well, I mean, you could just say that we need to make sure that we don't lose any of our staff and that we also, just work on programs where we're tweaking at the edge of the systems. For me, I think that that's probably not ambitious enough. But what we should be thinking about is, when we are developing new ideas based on behavioral science, what does that follow through? How do we have those systems in place so they are then scaled? And that is a mix of people and process. So we really need to think about that when we're designing ideas. It also leads us to think more broadly about, what do we mean by scaling? Now, this is an area where there's quite a lot of debate in a discipline called implementation science, and there are lots of different views on this. This is more of my personal view on it. So generally, when we talk about scaling, people have the idea that you take one thing from one setting and then take it to a bigger setting. But the behavioral science or behavioral insights world has really been focused initially on, how do we take ideas from academic research and then take them into public policy? There's much more of a sort of lateral idea of scaling, this conceptual idea of a concept in academic research and then taking it into policy. And when you start thinking about it in those terms, actually the idea of taking one idea from one policy context to another isn't actually that different from that initial sort of process of taking something from academic research into the real world. But the key thing that really matters here is the similarities and differences between the concepts that you're trying to scale from. And you want to understand whether or not they are meaningful. So when we do this here, we really think about how can you use behavioral science as a lens to identify similarities and differences between different settings so that you can understand whether or not an intervention or a solution may scale from one place to another. So then the question is, how do we define them? So talk about behavioral lens. Let's see how we apply that. There are multiple different frameworks that are super helpful to create solutions. So COMBI is one that we use quite often, which many of you will be familiar with. Stands for capability, motivation, opportunity, and motivation. So if you want someone to do something, do they have the capability to do so, both in terms of their physical capability to do it, but also the skills, do they have the opportunity to do it, and do they want to do it? Now, this allows you to kind of go through various different problems and then say, is this problem due to capability, opportunity, or motivation? And then how do you design a solution that will then overcome that? And it allows you to basically understand the similarities and differences between different settings. Like, do they have the same capability issue or motivational issue or opportunity issue? We also use our own East framework to do sort of things like that. So is the key problem that you're trying to change in one scenario the fact that it's just not easy for people to do something? Or is the key issue actually that your key messages aren't attracting attention? So we go back to those tax letters. Is it just that you're giving people information but they don't understand it? Or are there specific sort of social elements you want to consider, or the timeliness? That allows you to start categorizing problems, which then allows you to start thinking about, will the same solution work in this setting? So to give a little worked example, we have spent a fair amount of time thinking about how we can address antimicrobial resistance, which is largely caused by GPs prescribing too many antibiotics. If you go back to 2019, which is what this image is from, the WHO put out a list of top 10 existential threats that global health faces. Number one was actually a flu epidemic. So obviously they nailed that one. But then right below that, we had things like antimicrobial resistance and mega sort of superbugs that come out of that. So these are some big issues. Australia is also pretty high in its prescribing rate. So we looked at this issue originally in the UK to understand what would work. And actually using that behavioral lens to look at the problem allowed us to come up with some specific solutions. So we've developed these barrier identification tools, this QR code that you can have a look at it, just to kind of get you to think about what are the behavioral components that underpin a problem. So in this instance, what we saw was that there's a bunch of people, a bunch of GPs who are huge prescribers of antibiotics. In fact, the top quintile of prescribers basically prescribed as many as sort of the rest of GPs. And that's quite a common distribution that you see in lots of different areas. You see that in sort of drinking behavior, that the top drinkers account for most of the alcohol consumed, and the same in gambling. These are sort of things that you want to keep an eye out. So what you can do then is you can speak to them and you understand actually that a lot of people who are doing a certain behavior think that what they're doing is much more common than it actually is. And that's when you can use a norm, like the 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, to then correct that behavior, I guess, feed that information back so they can then get a sense of, I'm doing something, but actually it's out of line with what the rest of the population is doing. So you can see here how just viewing a problem through a behavioral lens allows you to come up with those solutions pretty quickly, and also allows you to start categorizing those problems like those tax letters and the antibiotic prescription here. So this is what the letter looked like in the UK. Says the great majority of practices in London, Birmingham, as this version says, prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. This run in the UK had a significant reduction in the number of antibiotic scripts given by the GPs who received that letter. It was then replicated in Australia by the Department of Health team and BETA, the Prime Minister and Cabinet's Behavioural Economics team. And then we also did a similar trial in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and found the same thing. So very powerful, very replicable, but also scaled, from some early work that we've done in tax, which doesn't, from the outside, look that similar, but by applying that behavioural lens, allowed us to kind of point to different solutions. Cool. So that hopefully has given you a sense of my views on the challenges of replicability and scalability. So let's go back to that systems point. Again, here, the key idea is that our behavioural solutions are very much focused on individual behaviour, and because of that, we're missing wider systems. Quick primer on systems thinking. If you haven't read it, this book here on the right is a fantastic guide to systems thinking, but it's also worth thinking about some of the outputs that you get from a systems thinking approach, which usually involves mapping out complex systems and seeing, what are the feedback loops that are created. So this one here on the left is from a government report in the UK called the Foresight Map for Obesity, where they mapped out all the different things that affect obesity. And what you can see is that it is very complicated. In fact, the original PDF of this that you can get online is so small that you can't actually read some of those boxes there, which quite often can lead people to think, it's too complex, we just can't deal with it. But one of the key things that a deep systems thinking approach does is it really gets you to focus on leverage points, which are, what are those areas, what are those nodes where I can have the biggest impact? Because if I affect this, it's not that we have this vicious cycle that then counteracts what's happening, but we have this virtuous cycle that then unlocks a lot of different things. And actually, if you start taking that systems lens and that behavioral lens together, then it can be super, super powerful. In fact, when I was talking earlier about those fines letters, it wasn't just that we were focusing on payments. We measured and looked at the downstream effects. And that's what I really want everybody on this call to start thinking about. If I'm focusing on a specific behavior, what are the other things that are affected here? And can we use that positively? So a nice simple example in terms of the intervention that sort of uses classic BI techniques but has a wider systems focus is this work that we did with Indeed, big like Seek here, where we're trying to increase the use of flexible working arrangements. And what we know is that most people do want flexible work arrangements, but there's almost like this behavioral market failure where at the time very few job offers, adverts offered flexibility. So the key thing here was actually not just how do we increase the use of them for employees, but like what are the ways in which we can change that ultimate sort of market failure. So the idea that we propose is a very sort of standard BI approach, one of defaults. So whenever an employer was posting a job, this is the pop-up they got. So it kind of forced them to make a choice. And so pop-up was a default, then there's an active choice. So what flexible working options would you consider for this role? So again, we're sort of framing it as the norm as well. And then, if they don't want it, then they can click not offered. And then, when the potential employees or the job seekers are looking at it, they're presented with these options in the JD. What happened? Well, what we saw was by offering that intervention, we saw a substantive increase in the number of jobs offering flexible working, which then flowed on to having a substantive 30% increase in the number of applications that those jobs received. So what you can see here is that just these simple sort of defaults are actually having quite a big impact on the market, because Indeed is one of the biggest marketplaces in the UK for jobs. So simple behavioral interventions can have a huge impact. You just need to think about what their first and second order effects might be. And we've done more and more thinking in the space, and I think it's really important that others do. So if you're thinking about simplifying information, classic BI tool. So quite often when we talk about sort of the nutritional content of foods, we have these really complicated ways of communicating that. But if there's simpler ways of doing that, so we have like the health star rating, they will have a much bigger impact on people's behavior. And our president, David Halpin, has really been doing a lot of work on this idea of like the shrouding economy. So not only, are there ways in which we can have complex information simplified, so it's sort of having a much bigger impact in the market, but is there also information that doesn't currently exist that people are making decisions on, and then just bad decisions? So one of the key things that we see is social media has been an area that we've worked on and looked at quite a lot. People generally don't know what the impact is on people's mental health, but are there ways in which we can get that information out there to say Instagram, not good, not good in terms of certain ways in which you view your body image, but if you move to YouTube instead, then that might have a different impact. So I think the key thing here is actually, are there ways in which we can surface information through a BI lens that has a wider sort of market and systems effect? And there's a few papers here that if you're interested, you can have a read on that kind of delves into this idea in a bit more detail. So just offer a quick summary, because I'm worried that there may be some questions. I think we've had quite a lot of successes in the BI sector, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take some of the criticisms that are coming out seriously and respond to them empirically. I think some of them have been sort of pretty grossly overstated. I think the idea of that behavioral science or behavioral interventions don't work is just patently false. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep testing things to make sure that they work. We should also keep thinking about how can we use behavioral science or behavioral insights as a lens to start viewing systems and thinking about, can we incorporate that thinking in the systems thinking toolkit to make better services, better programs, better policies? And also, can we use behavioral science as a tool to start understanding problems so that we can really think about how do we scale them more effectively, either by scaling them to more interesting and complex areas and sort of bigger social impact, or even just making sure that good ideas don't die after we've done a trial. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions now, but also I'll put my email up there if anyone wants to get in contact afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. Great presentation. So we've got a good kind of 10 minutes left for questions. So if anyone else has them, please just pop them in the chat as we go through. But we've got a couple that are coming up. So I'll start out with the first one. And it says, I'm interested to know, what do you see as the fastest growing or emerging areas for behavioural science application looking ahead to the next few years? Oh, you're on.
Good.
Oh, yeah.
Good question. So, I mean, I think one of the key areas that everybody's talking about at the minute is AI through various different lenses. I do think that that's an area where the behavioural component is fundamental. So there's lots of instances where you can see that people will defer their decision making to chatbots or AI, which actually leads to worse outcomes, or the fact that they can be a distraction. We've done some work in the UK where we've kind of been testing out, do chatbots help people make decisions? And actually quite often you see that they don't get used, or quite often they're used in interesting ways. Like they're almost sometimes used as like confessionals where people will talk about really broad sort of topics that aren't on point, and that actually leads to worse outcomes, or they give people more confidence in their answers than they probably should do. And those are all just the behavioral components. I'm not even talking about sort of the hallucinations and the confabulation sort of aspects that we're talking about, or the wider sort of privacy implications. So I think that that's an area where behavioral science is critical to think about.
Yeah, interesting. And have you ever seen, so you've talked about a few examples there where AI might be negatively impacting on people's behavior and the outcome, but is there any kind of research that you have come across, or situations where maybe it's looks like it's having a positive impact, even if it's just from an emerging research perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some ways in which I'm trying to think the work that we've been doing on chatbots has been useful in terms of, I guess, getting people to talk about contentious issues before they're talking to a human being. So I think that's a really useful place where it allows services to triage their resources more effectively and get people who wouldn't be comfortable speaking to a human being to start, I guess, talking about issues around harassment or any areas in that. sort of criminal justice space. So I do think there are some interesting spaces, but it's just so unknown at the minute. So it's one of these things where I think we should be testing it and trying it out and learning it, but also doing so relatively cautiously.
So we've got a question that's just come through that's on the topic, so I'll ask it, but could be a bit of a challenging one to answer. So I might just adapt it a little bit. But which of the current LLMs is the least biased in your opinion? And if you can't talk to that, I wonder if it's maybe talking to how can we actually reduce some of the bias that's in these models?
So I guess when you're talking about bias, I guess, are there any specific things that you'd be looking at? Because I guess bias has got a very broad definition, as in
it's come from someone else, but I guess I'm thinking about if we're building it on data that potentially already has, we've seen the examples where it's potentially biases towards gender or ethnicity, those type of things. If the person who asked the question wants to expand on it, but I guess some of those things, like what can we do to reduce that within these models?
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak to any specific ones because I think that they all have various different issues, and to be honest, they just keep evolving as through the conversation. I mean, the key thing is just testing it against the data, like not only the data that's going into it, so keeping a key eye on what data is going into it. Are we replicating some of the human biases around how employable somebody is if you're using AI to do a quick sort of view on a CV, and then seeing, based on our current organization, we are more likely to hire people like this. There's obviously a big likelihood that you're just replicating current human biases. So I think in designing these systems, you need to check for that, but also the choices that are being made in terms of the development of some of these AI tools, it's not just LLMs, are editorial decisions. And I think it's just really important to consider, what are the questions that you're trying to answer? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And do these systems actually, are they achieving them? So it's a very vague answer because it's such a broad question in terms of, LLMs are being applied in so many different ways. So I don't want to give one answer that covers all of it. And also, whilst we're doing there's a lot of conversation on Gyani, I actually think where AI can have the biggest impact is actually on just really narrow use cases, rather than a general generative AI. So are there ways in which you can use machine learning and AI to detect certain things on pathology reports and diagnosis reports, which is actually a really narrow use case. And I think actually we're probably likely to have more luck with that and then scaling it up rather than starting generally.
Yeah, great, thank you. So next question, wondering in regards to new behaviours, particularly when the social norm is not participating in the desired behaviour, what would be some strategies to use in this case?
I mean, the first thing that you should always wonder is, if we're trying to create a social norm and nobody is doing that, are we actually doing the right thing? I think quite often when we work in these policy settings, we're really keen to make sure that any behaviours that we're trying to encourage people to do is generally good for the individual or society writ large. So that's one sort of first reflection. The other thing is then on if it is actually something that they themselves would be amenable to do. I mean, you can't really use social norms. They're not going to completely change people's motivations, but thinking about, what are other people doing? Just mentioning the fact that many people are doing it. If nobody's doing it, then obviously you want to think about, should we be doing it again, or are social norms the best methodology to kind of change behavior? You might want to think about, can we just make it easier for people to do that? You can put a lot of effort in trying to create a social norm and trying to convince people to undertake a behavior, but if you make it really hard for them to do it, then you should be focusing your attention on making it easy.
Great, thank you. And for the person that asked that question, we had a really interesting talk, I think it was last month, around perceived and true perceived and true social norms as well, and how some that can be different, and to look into that to see where it can shift behaviour. So we've got the recording on that if you want to have a look at that session. Okay, so the next question is, have you come across situations where behavioural science assumptions have gone wrong when applied, and what happened?
Yes. I'm trying to think of any specific examples. I mean, quite often it's the case that the way in which you've defined your target behavior just isn't quite right. So and that it kind of leads your diagnosis astray. So I'm trying to think of some high level examples that we could talk about. So we do some work on apprenticeships. So how do you actually get people to follow through on apprenticeships? We've done this in overseas, and what we could see is that we really focused on the relationship between the employer and the apprentice, which is obviously what you want to do because you want to make sure that that's a strong working relationship and they can learn more and get coaching. But ultimately what you want is a more educated and trained workforce. So there's also the relationship between the teaching organization and the apprentice. And the key thing is, like, depending on which way you focus the sort of target behavior on, that will lead you to quite different interventions. So I think quite often we'd look at something and say, actually, which of those two do we want to focus on? Do we want to make sure the relationship between the employer is good? Because if it's great, then fantastic. But also, do we want to separate those apprentices quickly? Because it may just be that relationship is completely, it's not worth investing in. Instead, you want to focus on their training. And I think by kind of speaking to people, looking at data, triangulating that, doing some of the interviews or the service safaris you're talking about, you get a much better sense of what are the ultimate things you're trying to achieve. So like the systems thinking toolkit that I was talking about is also really useful at doing that. So it's been a very not a very concrete example, but I think the key thing is identify your target behavior. Is it the right leverage point? Is anything the ultimate outcome that you're trying to achieve? And then that will allow you to start thinking about how you use the BI toolkit.
Right. Okay, one question here from Gemma. Are there particular skill or knowledge gaps that you are seeing in the next generation of behavioural insights practitioners?
I think it's not necessarily that there's a skills gap here, but I definitely think the way in which people will view sort of behavioural economics and behavioural science is that you're taking ideas from the academic research and then putting them into practice. That is obviously what we're doing, but it misses a key thing, which is that it's much more of a co-design process. Mm-hmm. And actually, in order to do good BI work, you need to really speak to the people that you're ultimately going to be influenced by your intervention or implementing your intervention, so that you can start really grounding it in sort of implementation. So I think that's an area that is really fundamental to anybody who wants to get into the space. Is if you want to understand a problem, there's only so much that reading the academic journals will do. You have to read them, so don't get me wrong, but you also need to go out and speak to people, see what's going on, so that you can avoid implementation failures or scaling failures that we've talked about before.
Great, thank you. Next question. I've got lots of questions today, which is great. How do growing non-Western culture influence affect the existing models?
Yeah, I saw that question. I really like it. I mean, I think so. For people who aren't aware, basically, a lot of the body of work in behavioral science has come from largely US universities, to a lesser degree Australian and European universities. And what that means is that the people that we've been testing these ideas on are largely from those countries. And culture is an important fact of how people behave. It's not the only thing, but it is an important fact. And obviously, if we're then looking at a very homogeneous sort of set of cultures and developing these ideas, then they may fall apart as you start applying them in different settings. So the key thing there is basically try and encourage and fund research in other settings in universities across the globe, so that we aren't just doing that. And even when that research is being funded and delivered by Ivy League unis, make sure that you include more diverse samples and you're checking actually how broadly applicable my research is. It's an interesting thing when you read a bunch of papers, quite often they won't even mention the country, or all the papers won't even mention the country of origin, and they will usually be from the US or the UK. Now that people are much clearer at defining the sample that they're gathered from, but I think that's one space. And also including more diverse researchers in that, because they will have a sort of a more diverse set of sort of ideas and understanding of the culture they come from. The second thing is then when you're implementing them, just keep testing as well. I think it's really important that as we see a proliferation of teams, that they're also publishing and sharing their results in situ. So that's a really important thing we want to keep doing, so evaluating. And then the other thing around sort of going out and talking to communities and sort of doing that lighter touch qualitative testing is fundamental, because it means that you'll understand whether or not something is likely or unlikely to work, way before you've commissioned a large randomized control trial.
Fantastic, thank you. So I might wrap it up there, because we've just got a few minutes left and probably not enough time for a last question. But just to say a huge thank you, Alex. That was a very broad overview. I feel like I learned a lot from it, and there's some people have said in the chat, and likewise, I think I've made a few notes of some books to read, particularly around that kind of systems space, which I think is fascinating. So thank you for sparing the time with us here in the BSci community. And thanks everyone for joining and asking the great questions. We'll keep you posted on the next event. Thanks very much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.